Hello and welcome back to Bicycle Legs and another edition of Anniversary Albums. Just a programming note, I'll be moving these anniversary album shows to the first or second, in this case, week of the month, so that you can watch along, and when one of your favourite anniversary albums that I mentioned comes up, you can give it a play on its anniversary. Now, I've narrowed it down to 10 this month. I had 7 last month, but this month I've got 10, and even then I feel like I've left a few out. So make sure you let me know in the comments if there's any anniversary albums that you think I've left out that you think I should have included. Okay, now the first album I'm going to talk about is an album that was released on the 4th of November 1981, and that is Mob Rules by Black Sabbath. Now this is the second album with Ronnie James Dio on lead vocals, and it's the first one with Vinny Appice on drums. And I think it's a better album than Heaven and Hell, and in fact I think it's probably a top 5 at least Black Sabbath album for me. I think it's a wonderful album. I mean, Sign of the Southern Cross is wonderful, and Slipping Away, and Country Girl's a great song, but it's got to have the least metal opening lyric of any metal song I've ever heard. Fell in love with a country girl. Just doesn't sound very metal to me. Speaking of things that are not at all metal, the next album we're going to have a look at was released on the 4th of November 1986, and it is the debut album by one of my favourite bands of all time, They Might Be Giants. Now, I was lucky enough to get involved with They Might Be Giants right from the beginning when my sister showed me the film clip for Don't Let's Start in probably 1987. And I've been a fan of this band ever since. I really don't know how you describe them. They get usually lumped into alternative rock, but I always feel like alternative rock is such a non-category. It's like where you stick things when you can't think of any other category to stick them in. But They Might Be Giants are an absolutely unique band. Often, one of the things I always like about them is they often have very cheery, very happy sounding music, but then the lyrics are actually surprisingly dark. Great album, Don't Let's Start, what a wonderful single. I mean, there's so many good songs. I mean, there are 19 songs on this album. So, I mean, that's the other thing with They Might Be Giants. You always get a lot of songs. Great album, great start, and they just went from strength to strength after that album. The next album I'm going to talk about is an album that turns 50 this year. It was released on the 5th of November 1971, and it is Madman Across the Water by Elton John. What an album. Just an album that apparently didn't do all that well in the UK when it first came out, but it did do well in the States. I mean, it starts off with Tiny Dancer and then goes straight into Leave On. I mean, what a 1-2 for an album. But there's lots of really great songs on this album. Indian Sunset, Madman Across the Water itself, Rotten Peaches. I mean, it's just a wonderful early Elton John album. I do love 70s Elton John. I do love some of the 80s Elton John as well. But the early to mid 70s Elton John, definitely the primo stuff. Now, I could not do an anniversary album show for the month of November in 2021 without mentioning this album, which had its 50th anniversary on the 8th of November. It was released on the 8th of November 1971. And that is this album. Untitled, call it Led Zeppelin 4, call it what you will. I mean, what more needs to be said about this album? You know, I mean, it's got Stairway to Heaven on it, which most of us probably never need to hear again. But I mean, it's a classic song for a reason. It gets overplayed because it is such a classic song. I mean, you can say the same about Rock and Roll and Black Dog to a certain extent too, but I mean, it's a classic album. It's sold millions and millions and millions of copies for a reason, and it's because it is a great album. probably not my favorite Led Zeppelin album. I'll probably come and rank the Led Zeppelin albums at some stage, and we'll see where this one actually fits in. But and I won't give any spoilers for what my favorite Led Zeppelin album is. Going for a completely different genre of music now. An album that was also released on the 8th of November, but was on the 8th of November 1981, so it's having its 40th anniversary this year. And that is Architecture and Morality by Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark, or OMD. Such a good album. People like to write OMD off as synth pop, but their early stuff is very dense and experimental. For anybody in my audience who's a fan of progressive rock, I would suggest check this album out. It's not prog in and of itself, but it definitely has some proggy elements. Even on the song Joan of Arc, Maid of Orleans, they use a mellotron on that, and they use it really nicely. But these songs are accessible, but they're also experimental in certain ways. And I think this is a wonderful album. I think you can't go wrong with the first 4 or maybe 5 OMD albums. The next album I'm going to talk about was released on the 9th of November 1976, so it's having its 45th anniversary today, and this month I mean. And that is the debut album by Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. And it's a great debut. He establishes his sound right from the start. He's not one of these artists that was sort of searching for a sound for his first album or two. He hits his sound right from the get-go. Of course, the big songs that people know off this album are Breakdown and American Girl. But the whole of this album is just really sort of joyful sounding rock and roll, even when the lyrics aren't necessarily quite so joyful. It's just wonderful heartland rock. If that's your sort of thing, Tom Petty is a master of that, or he was. Sad loss for us in 2016. Great album, and as I say, right from the get-go, you get the Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers sound. Speaking of outstanding debut albums, this one was released on the 9th of November 1981, so it's having its 40th anniversary this month, and that is Business as Usual by Men at Work. Now, as an Australian, I'm kind of obligated to talk about Men at Work, but I'm happy to, because I think they're a wonderful band, even though they only managed to do 3 albums. And this first album is great. It's got Down Under on it for all you American fans. Us Australians are sick to death of that song. Me personally, I think it's the weakest song on this album, although that's a relative thing because this is a really, really strong album. I think it's a wonderful album. But, you know, it had the first single, Who Can It Be Now, which I think is still a great song. I Can See It in Your Eyes, Underground, Down by the Sea, People Just Love to Play with Words. It's just a great album. Really good sort of early new wavy sort of sound, little bit hints of reggae in it. Wonderful, wonderful sound, wonderful album. As is the next one we're going to talk about. It's a stone cold classic, celebrating its 50th anniversary this month. It was originally released on the 12th of November 1971, and that is Nursery Crime by Genesis. Now, I'm probably going to be doing a Ranking the Albums Genesis show fairly shortly, either this month or next month. This album's definitely going to rank very high. I came into Genesis originally in the 80s because that's when I first started really listening to music. I was a bit young to be hearing a lot of stuff in the 70s. So I was mostly originally familiar with the Phil Collins era, and I was a big fan of Genesis and the Phil Collins era. This is the first Peter Gabriel era Genesis album I ever bought. I bought it secondhand on a whim, and it broke them wide open for me as far as the early Peter Gabriel sound goes. I mean, any album that opens with the musical box and closes with the Fountain of Salmacis, and everything that's in between it, Return of the Giant Hogweed, Seven Stones, Harold the Barrel, fabulous, fabulous album, and still one of my favourites from the Peter Gabriel era, no doubt about that. The next album I want to talk about is also celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. It was released on the 13th of November 1981, and that is The Tin Drum by Japan. Now, this was their last album as Japan. They did later reform as Raintree Crow and do another album, basically the same lineup as Japan. But this album's wonderful. I mean, I really don't know how to describe it. It's not synth pop, it's not new romantic, it's more adventurous than that. It's, I mean, Japan had Richard Barbieri in it, and he went on to play with Porcupine Tree, obviously, who are just announced that they're doing a reunion. Looking forward to that album when it comes out. But this is a wonderful, atmospheric, slightly dark in places album. Probably their best album, I think. Certainly their most advanced and interesting. And the last album I want to talk about is also celebrating its 50th anniversary in this month. It was released originally on the 26th of November 1971. And again, when we talk about stone cold classics in the world of progressive rock, this has got to be one of them. And it's Fragile by Yes. Again, this was probably the first 70s era Yes I heard. I would have been introduced to Yes with something like Owner of a Lonely Heart. I had an older friend who used to lend me albums or give me albums sometimes, and one of the ones that he let me listen to was this album, Fragile. And fell in love with it from the minute I heard it. I mean, how can you not, just beginning with Roundabout? And again, you know, so many good songs on here. South Side of the Sky, and you know, there's all the little instrumental bits, the solo bits in it too. And this is also the first album that has what I think was the classic Yes lineup. John Anderson, Chris Squire, Steve Howe, Rick Wakeman, and Bill Bruford. To me, that is the number one Yes lineup. I got to see them with Anderson, Squire, Wakeman, Howe, and White in, I think it was 2003 or 2004 when they toured Australia. And they were wonderful. They were great. And they played plenty of songs off this album too. So those are my anniversary albums for this month. As I said, if you have any other anniversary albums that you think I should have mentioned, I certainly had plenty more on the list that I could have talked about. Please let me know in the comments. Tell me which ones of these are your favourites, which ones you're looking forward to giving a spin this month. If you want to see the albums that I'm listening to, including these ones and other anniversary albums and other things that I just happened to pick up on the way, please give me a follow on Instagram at bicyclelegs. My Instagram account is basically just me posting whatever record I happen to be listening to at the time. If you're interested in what I have to say about anything other than music, then you can give me a follow on Twitter, also at bicyclelegs. Please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps a young channel like mine out. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.